Okay, so we're back to talk about Isaiah. Isaiah 11, 42, and 61. There are two, maybe three things that bind these three passages together in my view. I think two is probably a better way to put it because I think it's like 1A and 1B, but one could see three easily enough. In all three of these passages, the Spirit appears. That's the Spirit of God or the Spirit of the Lord. And what happens in context of the Spirit is the Spirit is poured out on this messianic figure. Christians talk about this figure as Jesus. I am a Christian. I'm very comfortable with that kind of language. So if I talk about Messiah, if I talk about Jesus, if I talk about Christ in relation to these three passages, that's where I'm coming from. So the Spirit is poured out on the Messiah in all three of these passages. Now, some do say that the Spirit poured out in Isaiah 61 is intended to be thought of as the Spirit on the prophet, that is the writer himself. I'm not swayed by that argument. People are kind of divided about that. I think it is because of the effect of the Spirit. I don't think that's something that those effects in Isaiah 61 are those that a prophet person could bring about, but really are more related to what a king or a regnal or monarchical figure would bring about. So the Spirit is poured out on the Messiah. In each one of these cases, justice or righteousness ensues. Now that's really interesting. Here you have three texts from three different time periods, right? So you have Isaiah 1 to 39, the first 39 chapters, essentially being thought of as the work of first Isaiah, who is also known as Isaiah of Jerusalem. And this Isaiah, and I'm swayed by this argument, so I'm very comfortable with this. This Isaiah was active in the 8th century BCE, which is also kind of called the golden age of Israelite prophecy. Then second Isaiah, responsible for chapters 40 to 55, operates essentially during the exile, probably toward the end of it, kind of anticipating that the release from captivity in Babylon and return to the land. So maybe around 540 to 530 BCE, somewhere in there, maybe a little earlier, probably not much later. And then so-called third Isaiah, in Isaiah 56 to 66, probably after people have come back to the land, and probably in, maybe late 6th, early 5th century BCE. What's interesting is that sometimes when you compare these different periods in the book of Isaiah, you find not inconsistencies as much as tweaking going along. This is how this idea is given expression in these various time periods. But this issue related to the Spirit on the Messiah and the justice that is to ensue because of that is entirely consistent. In fact, one might make the argument, well, that just goes to prove that Isaiah, all 66 chapters, are the product of one writer. I think there are far too many questions to make that assertion. I think there are three Isaiahs essentially that bring this large book into being. But putting aside that authorship question for a moment, I want to talk about the Spirit. The Spirit brings justice and a view to justice. And in fact, in Isaiah 11, which is probably the paradigm passage for what would come later in 42 and 61, what we find is that this judge, when the Spirit comes upon him, this Messiah figure, when he judges, he will not judge by what his eyes see, right? Not going to, and what does the writer mean by that? What I think the writer means is he's not going to judge based on based on what the person looks like that's standing in front of him, right? So what I look like as a defendant doesn't impact how that judge will see me. Rather, he judges with righteousness, the plight of the poor, right? So it's not based on how good of the quality of justice is that I can purchase, but is based solely upon the strength of my case. If I'm wrong, if I'm poor and I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But if I'm poor and I'm right, then what Isaiah is promising to me with this messianic figure is that I will get the justice that is due me, and that is part of the problem. And it's part of the problem with many of the conversations that are happening throughout our world as it relates to justice. What is the justice that is due? And what are the impediments to that, to someone receiving that justice? What kind of justice do I get based on my skin color? What kind of justice do I get based on my socioeconomic status? What kind of justice do I get based on my accent? Right? I've been losing some weight, and I wonder about the treatment that I've had in some context when I was a little bigger than I am now. I don't know, but it's an active question to me. Maybe it's more than I should be thinking about, but it's just something that comes to mind. So when we look at Isaiah chapter 11, and the key verses are verses 2 to 4, and picking up at verse 4, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. Who are the meek of the earth? These are the people that don't have much, right? So this focus on justice related to the Messiah, if that is indeed Jesus, again, as a Christian, I say that it is, then the idea that should be coming out of Christianity is the idea of justice. Justice distributed equally to all. And we find the same thing coming up in Isaiah 42 and the same thing in Isaiah 61. The imagery in 42 is fairly quick, but the imagery in Isaiah 61, binding up the brokenhearted, releasing captives, giving sight to the blind. This kind of language speaks of a holistic restoration of the person. And that is something then that if the Spirit is poured out on Messiah, if Messiah makes that kind of thing happen, we get to the story of Jesus, and we see that it's entirely consistent with these passages in Isaiah 11. And then the same Spirit is poured out on Jesus' followers in Acts chapter 2. It should be then the mandate of Christians to act justly. So what then do we do with that? But it's not just I think a mandate for Christians, although Christians might tie it more to the Spirit of God and to a kind of spiritual gift. Not everybody's going to do it that way. Why does the writer or writers in the Old Testament or the New Testament, why do they make the case for justice? Because they see in ways that it's not just out there. So whether one identifies as a Christian or whether one doesn't, it would seem that the biblical writers see a need for justice to be established. And so no matter how you get there, establishing justice, and most of the justice, I'm obviously choosing certain texts to talk about this week, but if you read through the pages of the Bible, most of the justice does not have to do with that talion law retribution kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of justice. It is economic justice. It is social justice for those that can't defend themselves. That is a kind of message, that kind of thirst for equity that many folks find attractive, no matter their political or theological perspective. The question is, how do we make that happen? And that may be above our pay grade in this particular course. However, it's something for us to be thinking about as we move forward. Okay, so we'll come back and we'll talk about Amos.